My name is Paul Johnston. I'm from the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences here at Mount Royal University. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's event, the first in what we have dubbed the Critical Thinking Series at Mount Royal University. This will be a series of moderated discussions on what many would regard as difficult, if not contentious topics, but where better to address such things than at a university, the family dinner clearly being much too small for a crowd like this, and bars much too noisy. There will be at least 4 or 5 events in this series. The next one, and you can mark this in your calendars, will be on Friday, November 16th from 2 to 4 p.m. in the afternoon here in Jenkins Theatre. That's Friday, November 16th. And the question discussed at that time will be, should universities vet who will speak on campus? And will feature as one of the speakers Lindsay Shepherd. Shepherd, a graduate student and a teaching assistant at Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo, made headlines last year when she was severely reprimanded by faculty members there after playing in class video clips from a televised debate over gender-neutral pronouns, which included the controversial Canadian clinical psychologist and professor Jordan Peterson. The other speaker in our November 16th event will be announced when confirmed. This Critical Thinking series has substantial and much appreciated sponsorship from several sources, including the Endeavour Fund of the Faculty of Arts at Mount Royal, the Faculty of Economics, Justice and Policy Studies at Mount Royal, and the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship. This latter group is a Canadian organization dedicated to maintaining freedom in teaching, research, and scholarship, even when, in pursuing their scholarly goals, faculty or students take positions that are not in accord with popular beliefs or values. The Critical Thinking series was organized by the Rational Space Network at Mount Royal. This group was founded by Mount Royal's own Francis Whittleson in Policy Studies, seated beside me, who has been a bright light for academic freedom here and across Canada. The Rational Space Network includes members of the Mount Royal community committed to promoting unfettered academic inquiry, robust debate, critical thinking, and evidence-based approaches in post-secondary education, and ensuring that university administration provides a secular environment for students and faculty. Now you might be wondering, why on earth are such organizations necessary in Canadian universities or Canadian society at large, where freedom of expression is a cornerstone of our democracy and protected by the Charter of Rights? Well, erosion of academic freedom on campuses and free expression in Canadian society more broadly can come in many forms, some subtle, some overt. On the subtler side, we have the Safe Space Initiative at many Canadian universities and universities abroad, which seeks to protect student and faculty, especially those in marginalized groups, from contentious discourse so as to avoid offense and emotional harm. While it is essential that individuals who feel marginalized have the opportunity to share their experience and for society to address the ways people are excluded from full participation, stifling free speech puts that very participation at risk. The Rational Space Network maintains that while campuses must be physically safe for all, no ideas, no beliefs, no practices, however deeply held, should be safe from inquiry, scrutiny, or criticism, even at the risk that some individuals or groups may be offended. More overt are attempts by protesting groups who want to police the decisions of other groups as to whom or what they listen to. We saw this right here in Calgary this past summer when Jordan Peterson was scheduled to speak at the Arts Commons. A petition letter signed by several hundred Calgarians pressured Arts Commons to cancel the event, describing Peterson's rhetoric as toxic and violent. Arts Commons did not cave, and the event went ahead, with an electronic poll later showing over 20,000 Calgarians supporting Arts Commons' decision. Such protests can become aggressive in their attempts to ensure cancellation of speeches or to shout down invited speakers so as to interrupt the proceedings. And there are certainly examples from Canadian universities, and this is not a new phenomenon. You might recall an example perhaps pertinent to today's discussion that occurred at Montreal's Concordia University in 2002 when violent protesters succeeded in canceling a lecture from the then former Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, to the disappointment of many students that showed up to hear him speak. This type of protest seems to spring from the notion that some issues are so clear-cut, so resolved, that they're simply beyond discussion. Therefore, any question or challenge around the issue leads to moral outrage, and offended individuals or groups feel justified in their anger and in their ensuing actions to suppress unpopular speakers. The problem, of course, is that we all see our anger as reasonable and morally justified. So really, our only hope for facing controversial issues is reasoned and critical dialogue, which is the key aim of the Critical Thinking series. So one last Canadian example, and to show this phenomenon is not unique to the humanities and social sciences. This one involving the natural sciences comes from David Suzuki, who is hardly a standard for academic freedom, having stated that climate skeptics, which include many earth scientists, should be jailed, presumably on the grounds that there is already consensus in the scientific community on human-caused global warming, and that we are therefore beyond discussion on this issue. But those of us who actually attend earth science conferences know that there is not a consensus, and in fact there's plenty of scientific debate around data and interpretations arising from climate science. And with that, I'll leave you with a quote from one of the great paleontologists of our time, the late Stephen Jay Gould, who said, "The most erroneous stories are those we think we know best, and therefore never scrutinize or question." And now I'd like to invite my colleague, mathematician Dr. Peter Zissler, to introduce the main players in this evening's event.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Thank you. My name is Peter Zissler. I'm a mathematician in the Department of Mathematics and Computing. I'll first introduce our moderator, David Clemes. He's a historian in the Department of Humanities at Mount Royal University. Next, I'll introduce critical thinking facilitators. One is Sean England. He's a historian in the Department of Humanities at Mount Royal University. Another critical thinking facilitator is Frances Widdowson. She's a political scientist in the Department of Economics, Justice and Policy Studies at Mount Royal University. Now the speakers. I'm going to introduce first Ryan Bellerose. Ryan is a Métis human rights advocate from Paddle Prairie Métis settlement in northern Alberta. Ryan has had articles regarding the struggles of Indigenous peoples published worldwide. Second speaker, it's my honor to introduce Yves Engler. Yves is a Montreal writer and political activist. In addition to 10 published books, Yves' contributions have appeared in the Globe and Mail, Toronto Star, Ottawa Citizen, and Ecologist. Thank you. Let the games begin.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is David Clemes, as Peter points out. I'm a professor of early modern European history here at Mount Royal University, which means I bring no expertise whatsoever to this subject. But that's okay, I'm just moderating. I would like to thank Yves and Ryan for coming and speaking. We are facing some challenging issues here, and they're ones that people get very passionate about. For me, I have to tell you, having grown up with this controversy, I find the arguments sometimes rather overly familiar. And for me, I think one of the most interesting and important things about this evening is, especially in our current climate, the ability of us to demonstrate the possibility of dispassionate, rational sharing of ideas, to try to come and understand the passions that underpin the issues that drive the subjects we're going to be talking about tonight. Our topic is ostensibly about Canadian foreign policy, but none of us are fooled to think that we'll be talking very much about the interests of Canadian foreign policy in the long run. This will come very much down to a more fundamental question about homelands. And homelands, of course, are a subject of critical importance. Here we are meeting on the traditional lands, homelands, of the Niitsitapi people, of the signatories of Treaty Number 7, the Kainai, the Gani, the Tsuut'ina, and the Ayahe Nakota peoples. The challenge of reconciling settler settlement on the homelands of other indigenous people is something that we should all be, of course, and are acutely aware of. There are not direct analogies to the problem we're talking about tonight, and yet in some ways there are fundamental similarities. And one of them is the passions the subject excites. And I think it's very important to appreciate that although expressing one's passion is very gratifying, our neurophysiological friends can tell us all about how gratifying and pleasing righteous indignation is. But the truth is, we persuade no one with our passions. We persuade people by understanding their arguments and their positions and trying to nudge them perhaps to a different point of view and perhaps even amending ours along the way. As you can see, I'm an optimist. This evening's proceedings are calculated, and I thank Francis, whose courage, I'm not a member of the Rational Space Initiative. I have some ideological problems with it, if the truth be told. But I do admire Francis' courage in standing up for what she believes and facing considerable hostility in her community in promoting her views and her beliefs. And I would like to thank her for setting up a structure this evening that I think will allow us to have a productive and interesting discussion and not merely an event for grandstanding. What we will do is each of our speakers will be allotted a mere 10 minutes, and I can hear them chafing already at that. A mere 10 minutes to disarm this enormous problem and to articulate their positions on it. After each speaker has made their initial statement, they will be given 5 minutes to reply. And then we will go to our facilitators, Sean England and Francis Widdowson, who will ask a series of questions to not so much to challenge the speakers, but with a view of teasing out their meanings, of looking for the weaknesses in their arguments, so that each of their positions is seen to be in the best, most positive, persuasive light possible. And then we're throwing all caution to the winds, and we're going to let you lot ask questions, all right? I will tell you now, I'm a hopeless middle-of-the-road milquetoast liberal, and so we will have a very low tolerance for ad hominem criticisms of either of the speakers or of their ethnicities or of their ideological views. We are arguing ideas here tonight. We are not evaluating people. We need to be able to walk out of here capable of shaking hands sincerely. I'm sorry if I sound like a school marm. I'm a school master, as it turns out. Gentlemen, do we wish to flip a coin to see who will go first, or are you happy to accept the verdict of the script as it just got spit out by the computer? Which would have, it would have Ryan going first.
I'll flip a coin.
You want to flip a coin? All right, now the next question I have is who has a bloody coin? Who has coins anymore? We can flip my debit card. Shall we do that? Let's do that. Royal Bank logo is Ryan, or do you want to call it?
Let's do a pointer, David, because there might be issues.
All right. Trust the statistician to call me out on my...
Because there's a weight difference on the one side is heavier than the other.
Peter, come here. You have to do this. As a mere historian, I'm incapable of managing this.
I'm going to chuck it seriously. And somebody take a look. Heads?
Go ahead. Heads?
It has an animal on it. Looks like a moose.
That would be tails. Although, it is a moose's head. Anyway, I think Ryan's caught the stage. By the way, gentlemen, and I apologize in advance, I will be ferocious about timekeeping.
Absolutely.
I'm sorry about that, but it's of necessity. Yeah, and I will give you a 2-minute warning if you like.
Yes, please.
Very good.
All right. Can everybody hear me?
Yep.
All right, just want to make sure everybody in the back can. All right, so basically what we're talking about tonight is whether or not Canada is justified in supporting Israel. I personally think that the question should be more, how do we do more to support Israel? And I'm going to try to hopefully help convince some of you who might be on the other side of that. You see, I'm an Indigenous rights activist, so I believe in two things. I believe in being consistent, and I believe in being factual. Because unfortunately, when you talk about Indigenous rights in the modern day, everybody is going to try to delegitimize everything you say. For instance, I'm a Métis person. I grew up on a Métis colony called Paddle Prairie Métis Settlement. It's in northern Alberta. Yet every time I talk about Native rights, I have Native people who will say, oh, well, you know, like Belrose is kind of a little bit on the right side of the spectrum, which is humorous because most of my friends think I'm a raving lefty. And then I have the left side kind of always kind of saying, hey, you know, Indigenous rights, we like to talk about it, but we want to talk more about the environment. So somebody like me who actually wants to talk about Indigenous rights, and not, you know, in the hippy-dippy way, but in the way that it actually impacts Native people, I get marginalized. So when I talk about Indigenous rights, I actually use a checklist. It was developed by Jose Martinez Cobo. Now, Martinez Cobo was the reporter for Indigenous rights, I think in the 1980s, 90s. Now, he came up with an actual checklist on how to determine if a people is Indigenous or not. Now, you might be wondering, why is it important to have a checklist to determine something like Indigenous status? Well, if everybody gets to claim that they're Indigenous, pretty soon indigeneity means nothing. And when indigeneity means nothing, then why do we bother respecting Indigenous rights? So this struggle actually does directly impact me. It impacts my family. We're from the Red River in Manitoba. We're Indigenous to that specific area. We're not Indigenous to northern Alberta, where my family lives now and where they've lived now for approximately 100 years. We will never be Indigenous to northern Alberta. And it's important for you to understand that, because that's the direction I'm going to hopefully take you here. We're going to be talking about the Middle East a lot. And the reason we talk about the Middle East is because there's certain words that have been changed and there's certain terms that have been co-opted. One of those terms is indigeneity. You will hear from people that the evil European Jews came from Europe and stole Palestinian land. Now, anybody who even has a 5th grade education and can read knows that that's patently false. They know that for a fact, the region was actually called Judea. In other words, Yehuda, which is another word for Jew. The Jewish people came from that area. The Jewish people can trace all of their cultural constructs, all of their cultural artifacts to that area. There's a reason why when we talk about indigeneity, we talk about ties to the land, we talk about genetics, and I know that that's been in the news a lot lately with this whole war and nonsense. But the truth of the matter is, it's also about blood. Now, when you talk to actual Indigenous people, we will tell you there are 5 things that constitute being Indigenous: language, land, culture, blood, and spirituality. Now, I encourage people to think about it as if you're thinking about a hand. So all of these things are fingers, and one of them's a thumb. Now, if you take away a finger, what happens to your hand? Eventually, as you take away more fingers, your hand becomes less functional. So that's Indigenous identity in a nutshell. If you take away a people's religion, if you take away a people's connection to the land, if you take away the connection to the family, the blood, all of a sudden you have people that don't have a functional identity. Now, I want you to listen to me very carefully when I'm saying this, because this is basically what this entire argument hinges on. Does a people that has been expelled or evicted from their own ancestral homeland have a right to return to that homeland and create basically self-determination on their ancestral land? Now, I'm not asking you, do they have a right to go and oppress anybody, or do they have a right to kill anybody? Because clearly, I don't believe we should be doing that, or we'd be killing white people. That's not how we roll. What we want is for people to be able to live together. We want people to be able to sit and have a conversation without the idea that I can't listen to you, you can't listen to me, because we're so diametrically opposed. Now, I believe that the Jews are Indigenous. I can back that up. It's very simple. When you take a look at everything about Jewish people, look where it comes from. Where did they begin as a people? Where did they have their cultural coalescence? In the land of Israel. Now, if we're going to carry on with the idea of Indigenous rights, and that Indigenous people have a right to national self-determination, obviously the Jews have a right to create a state on their ancestral land. It's not really an argument. Now we have to decide, is it justifiable for Canada to support that? I believe it is. I believe that Canada has a moral imperative to support democracies. We have a moral imperative to support countries where people that are different, people that are minorities, homosexuals, women, all these people that have equal rights here in Canada, we should be supporting anywhere where they're pushing for equal rights in those places as well. Now, the countries we should not be supporting are places where they throw gay people off of roofs, places where they decide women shouldn't be allowed to drive cars or leave their houses unattended. Those are not the kind of countries we should be supporting. Now, I think I've made my point about the Indigenous status, so I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about the importance of consistency in language. When we talk about things, we have to be consistent. Because if I let somebody talk about something that we're talking about tonight, and using language inappropriately, using language incorrectly, if somebody comes to me and says, well, the Israelis are committing a genocide on the Palestinians, my people went through an actual genocide. No genocide in the history of mankind has ever resulted in the growth of a population, ever. And if anybody here can tell me of a genocide that's resulted in a population increase, I'd love to hear about it. That's just one thing. Another accusation we hear quite often is this accusation that Israel is an apartheid state. And I think that's patently ridiculous. When you take a look at it, Israel actually has an Arab party called the Arab List in the Knesset, where Arab people have full and honest participatory power in the government. They actually send people to other countries to talk about how Israel is an apartheid state from their Knesset. Think about that for a second. Do you think that would happen in apartheid South Africa? Were there even black people in the parliament in South Africa? The answer is no. Now, how many Indians are there in parliament in Canada? So when we're going to start talking about stuff like this, we need to make sure that we're being consistent. I've actually called out the government of Canada. I've actually said that Canada is technically much more of an apartheid state than Israel. And I'll tell you, because I grew up as an Indian in Canada. We're governed under the Indian Act. We're not governed like every other Canadian citizen. So I remember growing up, my grandmother couldn't sell vegetables at the farmer's market because there was a piece of the Indian Act that said that we were not allowed to grow produce on a native reserve and sell it in town. I don't remember this part of it because I wasn't born in the 60s, but my dad used to have to get a pass to go off the res. He had to go to the Indian agent and ask the Indian agent for permission to leave the reserve to go to work. And that continued until 1969, I believe. So when we're talking about these things, not only do we have to maintain an ideological consistency, but we have to maintain what I believe is academic honesty. We can't talk about these things and allow people to spread falsehoods. Now, if we're going to sit and have a conversation about who belongs where, I'm not a globalist, I'm a tribalist. But I firmly believe that all of us should be able to live together. I don't have a right to tell somebody how to worship the Creator. I struggle with it myself. But I don't believe that anyone has the right to do that. I don't believe that anyone has the right to tell somebody that their human rights are less than somebody else's human rights. But I also believe very firmly that, okay, so I wasn't going to do this, but you're actually incorrect about whose ancestral land we're on. This is Siksika territory. This is actually Blackfoot territory only. This is not Stoney Nakoda territory.
I said Niitsitapi.
I know, yeah.
Meaning the Confederacy.
Okay, because,
Which
yeah.
includes the Siksika.
Yeah, because unfortunately, a lot of people don't know that. They think that we're actually on Stoney territory, and the Stoney actually came here afterwards. So,
Yes, I don't think I stand corrected. Anyway, go ahead.
okay. But we have an issue with that, because I'm Métis. I'm from the Red River. I don't believe that I have any right to this land. This is not Métis territory. So the Arabs who came from the Hijaz in the 7th century and conquered the entire Middle East. Now they conquered several different indigenous people. We're talking about Amazi, we're talking about Assyrians, Circassians, you name it. If they were indigenous to the Middle East, they were conquered by the Arabs and they were Arabized. Now being Arabized is not a gentle process. That means they took their method of worshiping the Creator from them. They took their language from them. They took their culture from them. In many cases, they even took their cuisine from them. So when we're going to talk about the rights of indigenous people and why somebody has a right to an ancestral land, that's important. Now there's also the whole idea of sacred places. One of the most sacred places in the entire world for the Lakota people is what you guys would call Mount Rushmore. It's actually the Pahasapa, the Black Hills. Now, that was the most sacred place in the entire world for the Lakota people. What's on the Mount Rushmore now? They carved the faces of the people that colonized them into the most sacred hills of the Lakota people. Now, I'm going to ask you to shift gears for a second and take a look at what's on the Jewish Temple Mount. The most sacred place in the world for the Jewish people, something that they have over 2,500 years of connection to. There's a mosque on top of that temple. Why is there a mosque there? Because there was a mosque put there after the Romans conquered it, after the Romans smashed everything, and then some Islamic conquerors came, and then they conquered it, and they put a mosque on top of it. Now, Israel, because they actually respect religious plurality, what they did is they allowed it to stay. There's actually a Muslim group called the Waqf, and they look after the whole area. So, if we're going to talk about this kind of stuff, we need to talk about it in a context that's more intelligent and more honest. And I think that if we're going to be honest, the Jews are the indigenous people, and they have the right to have an ancestral homeland. You know, and international law says it. It dates all the way back to San Remo, when they very clearly said this is going to be an ancestral homeland for the Jewish people. And it wasn't given to them, by the way. That's another thing that's kind of a misnomer. There was a war, it's called the Israeli War of Independence, where the entire Arab world fought against them, and before that they actually fought the British. And they fought the British in the way that you fight occupiers. You fight an occupier, you don't fight an occupier out in the open. You fight an occupier by making the cost of the occupation outweigh the benefits of the occupation. And that's exactly what the Israelis did. So my personal belief is that we should be supporting Israel, and not just supporting Israel, but we need to find more ways to support Israel. Thank you.
So first of all, thanks for Rational Space for putting this on. Thanks everyone for coming out. I'm obviously going to be arguing the opposite side. No, Canada's support for Israel and Zionism has not been justifiable. We have a situation where we're not even allowing a Palestinian homeland on 22% of historic Palestine. We have a situation where Israeli forces have killed more than 200 peaceful demonstrators that are locked in the prison we call Gaza, surrounded by the Israeli military in recent months. We have a situation where Israel killed 1,400 in Gaza in 2008-2009, killed another 2,200 in 2014. We have a situation where a nuclear-armed state has bombed Syria hundreds of times in the past few years, has bombed Jordan, Egypt, Sudan, Lebanon, Tunisia, Iraq over the past decades. No, Canadian support for Zionism is not justifiable. Canadian support for Zionism doesn't begin as a Jewish movement. It's important to note that it begins as a Christian movement. At the time of Confederation, the leading supporter of Zionism in this country was a man by the name of Henry Wentworth Monk, who was an Ottawa area businessman who called for a dominion of Israel, just like Canada was, a dominion of the British Empire. As he put it, a Jewish homeland in the Middle East would be, quote, a logical center of the British Empire that could help form a confederation of the English-speaking world. As part of Canada's support for British imperialism at this time, you had leading Canadian politicians supporting Zionism, supporting the idea of bringing European Jews onto Palestinian land in the Middle East. You have Arthur Meehan, who at that point was Solicitor General, later becomes our Prime Minister, speaking to a Jewish Zionist audience. He said in 1915, "I think I can speak for those of the Christian faith when I express the wish that God speed the day when the land of your forefathers shall be yours again. This task, I hope, will be performed by that champion of liberty the world over, the British Empire." I think there's many people in this world that might not see the British Empire as a champion of liberty. But that was Canadian political ethos at the time. Canadians played a role in conquering Palestine on behalf of the British Empire. Canadian General Charles McPherson Dobell commanded a force that attempted to take Gaza during the Sinai and Palestine campaign. 400 Canadians were part of British General Edmund Allenby's Jewish Legion that ultimately would conquer Palestine. Canada endorsed the Balfour Declaration as part, still as tied into British foreign policy at the time. Canada supported the Balfour Declaration, which was that crass expression of colonialist thought that said that the British Foreign Secretary could give a land that in the Middle East to European Jews. This is Lord Balfour's explanation of his thinking. He said, quote, "In Palestine, We do not propose to go through the form of consulting the wishes of the present inhabitants of the country. The four great powers are committed to Zionism, and Zionism, be it right or wrong, good or bad, is rooted in age-long tradition, in present needs, in future hopes of far profounder import than the desires and prejudices of the 700,000 Arabs who now inhabit that ancient land. Clear British colonial thought. The Zionist movement was prepared, 40% of the Zionist movement was prepared to take part of Kenya as part of the so-called Uganda proposal, including Theodore Herzl in the early 1900s. Canada's support for Palestinian dispossession, its worst ever example of that, was Canada's role in the Partition Plan of 1947, which was the UN plan that gave, through the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, Ivan C. Rand, Canadian Supreme Court Justice, played the lead. He was the principal architect in the Partition Plan, and Lester Pearson played an important role in two different UN discussions of the British Mandate of Palestine and of the Partition Plan. The Partition Plan gave the Zionist movement 55% of historic Palestine, even though the Jewish population was less than a third, even though they owned less than 7% of the land. And this was clearly unjust from a Palestinian perspective, and rightfully the Palestinians rejected the idea of Canadians, Guatemalans, Europeans coming and deciding what was going to happen to their homeland. What the Partition Plan did was it provided the diplomatic legitimacy for the Zionist movement to ethnically cleanse Palestine in 1947 and 1948. 750,000 Palestinians were driven from their homeland. Canadians participated in that, hundreds of Canadians. The Israeli military, or the Israeli Air Force at the time, was actually headed up by a Canadian, former World War II veterans. Canadians provided weapons. Hundreds of Canadians participated, sometimes participated in the actual massacres of Palestinians, driving them from their homes. In 1967, Israel captured the West Bank and Gaza, now continuing to refuse to allow a Palestinian homeland on 22% of historic Palestine. In 1948, they captured 23% more than the partition plan gave them. They had 78%, and then captured the final 22% in 1967. Today we have over 600,000 state-supported settlers illegally installed in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. We have Jewish settler-only roads. We have water that's diverted to the settlers, Palestinians left with little. We have to enforce their occupation of the West Bank. The whole world considers illegal, including our own government. Go to the Global Affairs Canada's website. We have a great deal of repression, military repression to enforce that. And we have a Canadian government that refuses to stand up for international law. We consider the settlements illegal. We consider that is our official position of our government, yet we sell arms to Israel. Yet we have a free trade agreement signed in 1997 that includes the West Bank as where Israeli customs laws apply. So effectively, de facto Canadian support for Israel's occupation. We allow charities in this country, registered charities, that get a tax deductible status to raise funds for organizations, for settlement projects in the West Bank. Just one group, Christian Friends of Israeli Communities, says on their own website, we provide financial and moral support to the Jewish communities currently living in biblical Israel, the communities of Judea and Samaria, and previously Gaza. Judea and Samaria are the right-wing Israeli version of the occupied West Bank.
Or the historical.
We have the Jewish National Fund, which set up a Canada Park on the remnants of 3 Palestinian villages that were captured, destroyed by the Israeli forces in 1967. We have tens of millions of dollars in Canadian money going to support Canada Park on the remnants, legally occupied land, again, paid for by the Canadian taxpayer because the Jewish National Fund of Canada is a registered charity in this country. According to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in this country, we ban discrimination based upon religion, ethnicity, place of origin, yet in so many ways Israel, and particularly the Jewish National Fund, which again is a registered charity in this country, contravenes. So the Jewish National Fund controls 13% of of Palestinian land, of Israel, what's current day Israel. Most of it was stolen in 1947 and 48. The Jewish National Fund also has positions on the Israeli Land Authority, so it has a great deal of control over almost more than 90% of Israeli land, but 13% it owns. It excludes non-Jews from its land, right? Don't believe me. That's what the U.S. State Department says. That's what the UN Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights say. That's even what the Israeli Supreme Court says. In fact, it's even what the Jewish National Fund says on its own website. You can go check it out right now. This is the Jewish National Fund. This is a registered charity in this country that's raised $60 million between 2014 and 2016. The Jewish National Fund on its own website says, quote, "A survey commissioned by the JNF reveals that over 70% of the Jewish population in Israel opposes allocating JNF lands to non-Jews, while over 80% prefers the definition of Israel as a Jewish state rather than as a state of all its citizens." That is a registered charity in this country. This is a form of racial discrimination and land use policies that we made illegal in this country 70 years ago.
Except on reserves.
I'm going to ask you not to
Sorry,
interrupt or
there's a
anyone
limit
to
how much-
embarrass themselves by heckling. Let us keep our emotions under control, and let us delight in whatever absurdities we believe other people to have. We're not going to have broken argument here. I will expel people who interrupt speakers. Please continue. Except I get to heckle. Eve, you have 2 minutes.
So here we have, just to give you a sense, we have a registered charity in this country that raises tens of millions of dollars every year for an organization in Israel that excludes non-Jews from its territory. We made racist land covenants illegal in this country 70 years ago. There used to be land covenants that said you couldn't sell your property to a Jewish person, to a black person, to an indigenous person, etc., etc. In fact, it was actually the Canadian Jewish Congress in the late 1940s that led the charge to get rid of those racist land covenants in this country, yet we support that in Israel today through our tax-deductible donations. There is no moral justification for Canada's support for ongoing Palestinian dispossession. This is a conflict that's been going on for a whole long time. Just to give you a sense, to go back in history, at the time of the partition plan, this is what the lead Middle East expert said about the partition plan that gave 55% of historic Palestine to the Zionist movement, even though Jews were less than 7% owned less than 7% of land and were less than 33% of the population. The expert at the time, who was against Canada supporting the partition plan, Elizabeth McCallan, the only Middle East expert at the time at External Affairs, said, quote, Ottawa supported partition, quote, because we didn't give 2 hoots for democracy. And then she said that the support for a partition plan would lead for the Middle East being for, as quote, for 40 years of war due to the lack of consultation with the Arab countries. In fact, it's been a lot longer conflict than that. Because we haven't cared about what the indigenous population has to say going back for more than a century, that's why this conflict continues. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. I was about to call for that. Thank you. Well, my heart rate's up twice. This is great. Thank you, gentlemen. We will now give you that opportunity to reply to one another. And we'll start with you, Ryan. You will have 5 minutes to make some additional comments or to challenge some of Eve's claims.
All right, so there's a lot of nonsense there for 5 minutes, so I'm going to go through this pretty quick. First off, the whole idea of peaceful demonstrators at the Gaza border. Peaceful demonstrators don't have bombs, guns, fire kites, and slings. That's not what peaceful people do. Peaceful people don't light tires on fire so they can make smoke screens. That's not peaceful. Just throwing that out there. The total number of casualties in this entire Middle Eastern conflict, since he brought up the concept that clearly Israel is bad because of these casualties, 45,000 people on both sides since 1947. Think about that for a second. 45,000 people on both sides for casualties. Less than 1 year in Syria, 45,000. Less than 1 year. So that's what it looks like when an actual modern state attacks its own people. 45,000 people in 1 year. We're talking, I believe it's at 535,000 now in less than 10 years in Syria. So if we're going to talk about casualties, that's where you want to look. Zionism. First off, we got to agree on what Zionism is, and I have a feeling that my friend here and I won't agree on it, because Zionism is simply the imperative of the indigenous people to return to their ancestral homeland and create a state. That's it. And Zionism predates Christianity. Zionism actually started the first time the Jews were evicted from their ancestral homeland. Zionism is something that Jews can tell you about. They pray to return to Jerusalem 3 times a day. They don't pray to return to Uganda. British support, that's a joke. The Brits actually had an arms embargo. The Jews were fighting the British for more than 5 years before this happened. I'm actually kind of shocked that you would even bring that up. But it brings me to my next point, the whole idea that first he quotes international law, and he talks about the partition, and he talks about the support that the colonialists had for the creation of Israel, but then he says that Israel isn't legal according to international law. So maybe we should think about that. He quotes the Charter of Rights, but then he supports BDS. That's kind of interesting. I don't know how he reconciles that. That's kind of some mental gymnastics. A nuclear state that bombs other people. As far as I'm aware, Israel's never even admitted that they had a bomb, let alone threatened to use it. So that's kind of interesting. You know, the British support thing too, by the way, the leading general on the other side in the Israeli war for independence was Pasha Glub, a British general who led the Jordanian Legion that was armed and supplied by the British. All right, what else? Oh, partition plan. So the partition plan gave this massive amount to Israel, except for the fact that Jordan, when it was created, the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan was given 72% of the Palestinian mandate. 72%. You know, that's a lot. I'm just going to throw that out there. Let's see what else we have here. Ethnic cleansing. So in Israel, I don't know if you guys are aware of this, but in Israel, there's actually a lot of Arabs. A lot of Arabs. I believe the population is something like 16% that's strictly Arab. It's 22% of non-Jews. So if they're ethnic cleansing, they're really bad at it. 1967, defensive war. That's what happens when everybody threatens to go to war with you and they use brinksmanship politics, and then you kick their ass and take your land back. Sorry about your luck.
Applause is tolerable.
Yeah. Israel doesn't exclude Jews. That's a ridiculous statement. I'm actually shocked that he would say that. Here's the deal, all right? I come from a reserve. There's not a lot of white people on the reserve. The reason for that is because it's a reserve. Israel is the ancestral homeland of the Jews. They're trying to build a Jewish homeland. There's nothing wrong with that. Now, do they kick Arabs out? No, that's a lie. That's patently false. You can go right now to Israel, and you can go to anywhere. You can go to Jaffa, you can go to Haifa. There's more Arabs, I think, in Haifa than there is Jews. That's a ridiculous statement. I was actually shocked to be sitting there listening to that. Oh, and the selling land. Let's talk about selling land. I don't know if you guys follow the news, but you can Google this. There was recently an Arab American who was kidnapped while he was visiting Palestine, and he was kidnapped by the PA. He was kidnapped by the PA because he was helping sell land to Jews, because that's illegal. And guess what? If you do that in the PA, the punishment is death. So there's an American citizen right now who's been kidnapped by the Palestinian Authority, and he's probably going to be murdered in the next couple days. Now, if you sell land to an Arab as a Jew, you get a bill of sale. So, I mean, I looked at all the stuff that he was talking about here, and this is exactly what I'm talking about. We can't have an honest conversation if people are not going to be honest. You can twist things as much as you want. You can talk about international law. Yeah, you know what? UNESCO, which is supposed to be the United Nations body that determines where somebody's ancestral stuff happens, they tried to say that the Temple Mount, which is clearly a Jewish site, it's mentioned in the Bible a few times, they tried to say that that's a Muslim sacred site now. Like, come on, let's not get ridiculous here. So, like, I know that Eves is going to have some more stuff to talk to you about British colonialism. I don't give a shit about British colonialism. British colonialism happened here. British colonialism was defeated in Israel.
Thank you, Ryan.
So, first of all,
So in 1900, to get into some statistics, in 1900, 94% of Palestine were Arabs. There were some Christians and some Jews. So, I mean, I don't really know how you can argue with the demographics, but clearly some people can. In 1947, still more than 2/3 were Arabs. This is how the 1920 British government interim report on the civil administration of Palestine said, which said there were 700,000 people there, said, this is 1920, 4/5 of the whole population are Muslims, a small proportion of these are Bedouin Arabs, the remainder alternately speak Arabic and are termed Arabs, are largely of mixed race. Some 77,000 of the population are Christians, in large majority belonging to the Orthodox Church and speaking Arabic. The minority are members of the Latin or the Unite Greek Catholic Church, or a small number of Protestants. The Jewish element of the population numbers 76,000. Almost all have entered Palestine during the last 40 years. Prior to 1850, there were in the country only a handful of Jews. I mean, that's the British Authority in 1920. It's obviously, it's kind of hard to argue with those statistics. Now, it is important to understand about British colonialism. I think there is the idea, it is undoubtedly true that at the end of the British period, the Zionist movement, once it was strong enough, it did want the British Authority to be gone. There's no doubt about that. But it was the British who provided the protective umbrella for more than 2 decades that allowed the Zionist movement to build itself up, to become strong enough to conquer the area, famously the British role in suppressing the Palestinian general strike in the 1930s. And so it's also important to be really honest about the Zionist problem, of course, right? What do you do in the case of the Zionist movement when you do have all these Palestinians on the land? When you want to have a Jewish homeland on that land? You have it's pretty clear that you have a problem. So you have to deal with that problem. And the way to deal with that is to expel Palestinians. You know, the basic ethos of the Zionist movement is as much Palestinian land with as few Palestinians as possible. That's been the overarching ethos, and it continues to be the overarching ethos of the Zionist movement. And in the 1930s, the Zionist movement began to talk seriously, mostly privately, but talk serious about the plan of expulsion. And they had a plan of expulsion. The Plan Dalet was the plan of expulsion. How do you deal with the problem of having too many Palestinians on a land that you want to make a Jewish supremacist state? Well, you've got to drive them out. And in 1947-48, 87% of Palestinians were driven out from what became the Jewish state. They were quite successful. It was successful ethnic cleansing. It wasn't perfect ethnic cleansing. If that's an argument that it was not ethnic cleansing, it's a kind of interesting argument. But it was a plan of ethnic cleansing, and it's important to be clear about the fact that Canada's role in all this. I don't come at this. I come at this as somebody who grew up in Vancouver, as a Canadian, and really as somebody looking at it from a Canadian foreign policy perspective. And Canada's contributed to the injustice all the way through, right? Today, Israel is wealthier per capita than Britain. But we have hundreds of charities in this country that raise hundreds of millions of dollars every year of tax deductible. So our government subsidizes this, sent to Israel every single year. How many charities are raising funds for Britain?
Wait a couple of years.
Right? Yeah, the austerity.
Sorry.
So, but this is a real question. We have this. And these charities that are being supported. Some of them support racist organizations like the JNF that are explicitly colonialist institutions, explicitly racist institutions. Some of them support the Israeli military. Right? And a whole series of registered charities in this country that support the Israeli military. Some of them support settlement projects illegally, even our government says they're illegal. This is happening today. We have all kinds of military relationships with the Israeli military, right? We sell arms to Israel, right? We have intelligence agreements. There's a whole history of Israeli spies using Canadian passports in their assassination missions, most famously in 1997 with Khalid Mashal in Jordan. Right? There's a whole numerous ways. This isn't some abstract a conflict that we're removed from. This is us contributing to Palestinian dispossession. And it's wrong. And we should oppose anyone who has any sense of internationalism, any sense of humanism, should oppose it.
Thank you, Eve. Both of you are right on time there. I totally immersed in your arguments and forgot the clock completely, so thank you. We'll now move to the next element of the evening's proceedings, and that will be a series of questions asked by Francis Widdowson and Sean England, our two facilitators. They will alternately ask questions, each of them asking a question first to Ryan, then each of them will ask a question to Eve, and we'll proceed with those for as long as time allows, probably about 30 minutes or so. And we'll begin with Francis, and I believe your first question is to Eve.
Yes.
Sorry, to Ryan.
To Ryan.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much to both the speakers, actually, for quite interesting arguments. And maybe it might be helpful if I just ask Ryan if I've got his arguments, if he agrees with my reading of his arguments. As far as I can tell, you make two arguments for the Canada's support of Israel. The first is the indigenous rights argument, which is that the Jews have an indigenous right to Palestine.
They have an indigenous right to an ancestral homeland that is Palestine. Yes.
Okay, so that's the first argument. The second argument is that Israel is basically, you consider it to be a liberal democracy, and since Canada supports other liberal democracies, it should support Israel, whereas Palestinians, the kinds of political systems that they have are not liberally democratic, or certainly other Arab states in the region are not liberal democracies, so why should we support the various Arab states and not Israel?
Yeah, I think that's apt.
Okay, so with respect to the indigenous rights argument then, I'm wondering how that's reconciled with human evolution and migrations of people over the globe. So I'm not quite sure when a group actually becomes indigenous. So with respect to the Jews, for example, there was groups there before them, and I think it's the Canaanites and all sorts of groups, and also in terms of indigenous people in Canada, I know in this area that Gros Ventre was a group that was pushed out into the States. So if we're going to start saying groups should have a right to their ancestral homeland, how do we reorganize the globe on that basis?
Okay, so first off, we wouldn't reorganize the globe. And you have to understand that indigeneity has nothing to do with timelines. So there's no such thing as a statute of limitations on indigenous status. So if you're indigenous, you're indigenous. Now, the way that you phrased your question is actually really quite interesting, because it suggests to me that you maybe don't understand that indigeneity, because it has nothing to do with the timeline and it has everything to do with the coalescence of a people, that's where you would be able to reconcile these things. So my people haven't been around for a long time, the Métis. We've actually only been around technically since white people showed up here, right? So we're talking 1700s really. Now, my people are still recognized as indigenous people. Why? Because we had a coalescence of a culture. We became a people. We actually became a peoplehood. We created a culture. We created a language called Michif. We are specifically from one specific area. Now, I know that the Canadian government would have you believe that anybody that's half Indian is a Métis. We strenuously disagree with that because we believe in consistency. And if we're going to be consistent, you have to have the coalescence of a people in order to become a people.
Thank you, Ryan, and thank you, Francis. Sean, do you have a question for Ryan?
Yeah, for Ryan. Well, first of all, I'd like to preface my question by saying that my own interest in this meeting and dialogue is to hopefully find ways to encourage more of this kind of talking, because when talking ends, fighting starts, and I think it's well past that in some respects, but I'm happy to be here, and thanks for letting me be a part of it. And so, Ryan, I'm just, I'm curious about, I guess, the question of Palestine, and you say that charges of genocide are easy to debunk. I think that could be true depending on how you define genocide. So I'm just curious, how do you define genocide?
To me, a genocide is technically any time that you make a serious attempt to depopulate a people. So when you try to destroy a people. Now, again, if we go strictly by the definition of genocide, and here's the problem, is that most people don't realize that the actual definition of genocide is a little bit more nebulous. So you could make an argument if you're, being a little bit facetious. But my whole point is that every genocide, every actual genocide in the history of mankind has resulted in the vast depopulation of the targeted population. So if you look at the Armenian genocide, a lot of Armenians died. If you look at the Holocaust, the Shoah, a lot of Jews died, a lot of Roma died. So when you look at those kinds of things, when you look at the depopulation of the North Americas, a lot of native people died. Now, we didn't recover from that. We're still, our populations are tiny because of these genocides. So when you make the claim that somebody's conducting a genocide, and yet at the same time your population has literally increased dramatically, I find that kind of disingenuous. So that's why I say that you can debunk it simply by looking at the statistics. And the statistics show if 45,000 people died since 1947, that's not a genocide. 45,000 people, to be honest, if you're looking at it in context of Middle Eastern conflicts, 45,000 people dying, that's usually a year in Syria. I mean, almost as many people died in 1 month in Jordan when Jordan decided to take out the Palestinian Liberation Organization. They called it Black September. Almost 30,000 people died in a month. So that's why we have to look at these things with a little more intelligence, I believe.
Thank you, Ryan. Francis, you have a question for Eve.
Yes, thank you very much. And maybe I should do the same thing with Eve that I did with Ryan in terms of the arguments, that what I think your arguments are. I think that your arguments are basically that that the whole Israel-Palestinian conflict is a consequence of the attempts by imperialist powers to build up a friendly force, a friendly area in that region. So it really doesn't have very much to do with religion in your view. It's got more to do with they saw a chance, and it started off with the Christian Zionists, according to you, more than the Jewish Zionists, but that was seen as an opportunity to put in sort of an ally in the region that could help imperialist kinds of ventures in the area.
I would agree with that.
Okay, so in terms of the situation now, so we might be able to agree that it should never have happened, let's say, like that should never have happened, but it has happened. Now that it has happened, and we have these two nations, what appears to be two nationalist types of conflict, two aspirations for the same land, I'm wondering about how do you respond to many of the common criticisms of the Palestinian political forces, which is and this is especially relates to Hamas, and Hamas's attitude towards Israel, which, as far as I understand it, I'm not an expert in this area, but I believe they do say that they want to destroy Israel, or they want to wage an armed struggle against Israel. How do you see that reconciled? Or when people say Israel really has to defend itself and it's being bombed and it has this violence that's being perpetrated against it, how do you respond to that sort of argument?
I think I would go at this in many different angles. Israel has been the aggressor. Zionism has been the aggressor, always. Israel is the power. Palestinians, if you take a simple look at GDP, contrast the Israeli GDP to GDP in Gaza, it's like 30 times, 35 times. Israel has nuclear weapons. Palestine doesn't even have a military. So to try to some sort of equivalence of like a concern of, okay, Hamas, I even believe they've actually changed their charter, but at one point they had a charter that didn't recognize Israel and whatnot, or wanted to wipe Israel out or whatever. Okay, so there's a day school in Toronto, a Jewish day school called the Leo Beck Day School, that was just in the news because there's somebody put pro-Palestinian comments on the outside of the school. I did a little looking into what goes on at this day school. There's a big Israeli flag out front of the day school. I found very quickly, when I punched in JNF Leo Beck Day School, I found a Twitter post of a map, a Jewish National Fund map, that they were 9 or 10-year-old kids who were supposed to be learning. They would find it as a virtual map, that these 9 and 10-year-old kids were supposed to be learning about Israel. What was not included on the map? Palestine, of course. Even the 22% of historic Palestine wasn't on the map of a Toronto Jewish day school, and we are talking about Hamas's charter, right? This is, if you want to talk about the denial of Palestinian existence, it's happening today, right now, in schools in Canada. It's happening. Right? And we're concerned about the Hamas's charter when Hamas is a resistance movement against a force with a nuclear weapon. I'm an atheist. Am I supportive of all of Hamas's ideology? Of course not. Right? Would I be supportive of all of the ANC's ideology? Would I be supportive of all of those fighting against French imperialism in Algeria? Of course not. Was I supportive of all the ideology of the Mau Mau in Kenya in the 1950s fighting against British colonial rule? Of course not. But we're going to talk about Hamas's charter in the context of this power imbalance when we, right here in this country, are providing so many different ways of denying Palestinian existence. We talk about Hamas's charter doesn't believe in the existence of Israel. What about the Canada-Israel Free Trade Agreement that allows products being in illegal settlements to enter Canada as if it's part of Israel? So you have wines labeled, they're being produced in occupied West Bank, being labeled as made in Israel. They're coming into our liquor stores today. Oh, but we're concerned about the Hamas's charter. This is it's farcical. Right? It's farcical. It's a prison. People are being fired on for just marching, going towards a fence that snipers just literally, do I want that one? Do I want that one? Maybe that one. Ah, that one's better. That's what's happening. And we're concerned about Hamas's charter?
Excellent. I think thanks, Eve. Sean, you have a question for Eve.
Yeah, Eve, I find your perspective quite interesting. My own work is on anti-Semitic thought in the 1930s. I'm writing about in the Americas specifically, and thoughts about indigenous
Can you speak?
and thoughts about what indigeneity is, and different group thoughts about nationalism in the 1930s. So I was very interested when I read your overview of kind of the Anglo-Israeli movement dating back to the 1600s. And so I just want to clarify how you define kind of Zionism and the timetable you talk about. It seems, I'd like to hear you expand a bit more on this idea that Zionism didn't exist prior to being invented by Christians. In what, about the 17th century? Could you expand on that? And then perhaps I could ask your adversary here about it.
So Zionism doesn't begin. Okay, so officially, of course, we understand the Zionist movement as beginning with Herzl in the late 1800s, right? But Zionism actually begins as a Christian movement. It comes out of the Protestant Reformation and more literal readings of the Bible, right? And I don't have the numbers in front of me. I have them in my book, but there's some in the late 1700s. This one author did an analysis. He found there was 50 books mentioning Zionism in a certain period in the late 1700s, right? Like I mentioned, in Canada, Henry Wentworth Monk is the most well-known, but there was a series of somewhat prominent ministers who were supporting Zionism in the late 1800s. Canadian Zionism doesn't begin until decades after Christian Zionism is flourishing, and in the case of Europe, centuries. And what it was when it becomes like a serious movement, was this mix of Protestant thinking about around the Bible and Jewish return and that sort of fulfilling biblical prophecy, and simultaneously Britain getting more and more interested in the regions, right? Britain takes control of Egypt in 1882. The Suez Canal becomes very important in terms of its control, its wealth creation in India, right? And so increasingly British geostrategic thinkers see the Zionist movement as potentially a sort of, as Francis was putting it, like a Western outpost to help sort of solidify their position in the region, specifically around the Suez Canal and wealth extraction from India. And so Canada, as a British dominion and as a European settler outpost here, Zionism was popular among Canadian elite at the time because it was into British imperial thinking. And so that's why, Arthur Meehan, I quoted, there's many others you can find of Canadian politicians in the early 1900s supporting Zionism. And also, it's also part of why Zionism is more popular among the Canadian Jewish elite in the early 1900s than the US Jewish elite at that time. Because there was more of a sense of sort of dual loyalty in the US being supportive of Zionism, whereas in Canada, it was, as one author put it, it was Canada-British, basically your Zionism was basically supportive of British imperialism and of the British Empire. And just to go further, we mentioned anti-Semitism. So with the Balfour Declaration of 1917, you have the Canadian, you have the Jewish community in this country supportive of Britain's attempts to take Palestine from the Ottomans. And Britain, of course, at the time was in alliance with the anti-Semitic Tsar, right, in Russia. So that was a World War I alliance. And so, but that didn't seem to sort of bother the Jewish community or elements of the Jewish community at the time, because they were so much tied into British imperial kind of outlook. And they got very much in support of Zionism. And go further with that. If you look at the amount of funds raised for Israel or for Zionism at that time, after the Balfour Declaration, it just expands substantially, right? So because Britain by 1917 had provided its formal support for the Zionist movement, that just opens up even more support within the Jewish community for Zionism at that time. So there's a mixing of ideologies that are driving this, and I think it is important. What's essential to understanding why Zionism appears when it does is, of course, it's the rise of nationalism, right? It's the rise of nationalism in Europe in the late 1800s. And it's also the height of imperialism, right? You have the scramble for Africa setting up in the late 1800s, and Zionism is coming into that, and it's basically at some level it's basically first of all defining Jews as a nation, and then part of what a nation was conquering others, right? And that's what was going on in Africa. We were carving up the continent. Britain, France, Canada was involved in different ways. So yes, it's for sure, it flows out of imperialist ideologies, it flows out of the Protestant Reformation, and it flows out of nationalist ideologies of the late 1800s.
Thank you, Eve. We've got time, I think, for one more round. And so what I will do is give Francis an opportunity to ask Ryan one more question, and Sean, you can come back and ask Eve one more question. So Francis, do you
Sure.
want to pose something here?
Yeah, so I just wanted to ask Ryan about his second line of argument, which is about the discrimination that is the idea of supporting Israel because it's a liberal democracy. And I'm just wondering how you respond to Eve's claims about things like the Jewish National Fund, the idea that people living in Israel have to recognize it as the Jewish state when, in a liberal democracy, we wouldn't really see those aspects as being indicative of liberal democracies. And I'm just wondering a little bit about your analogy between the reserve system in Canada and the land, sort of legal rights that are given in Israel for various lands. For example, with respect to Indigenous people, while it's true that one could characterize the reserve system as a discriminatory system, especially historically, Aboriginal people aren't prohibited from buying land in Canada. So people can move off the reserve and buy land anywhere in Canada. They're not prohibited, whereas I believe in Israel...
Actually, you're incorrect. We can't buy land adjoining the reserve. They won't let us do that, just so you're aware.
But what about non-Indigenous people buying that land?
Anybody can buy land that's abutting except for somebody of that nation. So the people, I don't know if you guys know this, but just recently Siksika had a huge fight with the government here because they wanted to buy land that was adjoining the Siksika Reserve after they sold Castle Mountain. And the government basically said, we'll give you land, but it can't be adjoining your reserve.
Okay, so that is probably analogous, but generally speaking, you could come to Calgary and buy land in Calgary or anywhere else. But if you're if you're an Arab person living in Israel, I'm not sure what Eve was, I don't know the stats on it, but there is a lot of land that is not available to Palestinian or Arab, people of Arab descent. So just how do you respond to that?
Okay, so first off, if you're an Arab, you can buy property almost anywhere in Israel, but you can't buy it on JNF land, what they actually call national land. So it's no different than here in Canada. Nobody's allowed to buy land in the national parks, right? So the whole idea that Arabs can't buy land is patently ridiculous. Like if you go to Israel right now, there's very few communities in Israel that are Jewish only. And that's one of the things that I find people are making these kinds of ridiculous claims. Yeah, you know what, in some of the areas in Judea and Samaria, it'd be very difficult for an Arab to buy a house for obvious reasons. I mean, recently one of my very close friends was stabbed in the back while he was grocery shopping in Gush Etzion. So, I mean, people are a little less inclined to be trusting. Now, in regards to Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, if you're an Arab, you can move into almost any of those, like the major cities. You can buy an apartment building. This is easy to find. I mean, it's not difficult to go on Google right now and actually say, can I buy land? Like, that's why this whole, like sometimes these arguments, they're ridiculous to me. I mean, if you go into almost every community in Israel, there are mosques and churches. Other than places like Mia Sharim where the ultra-Orthodox live, you're going to be able to find churches, mosques, synagogues, right? I defy anybody to go into anywhere in the PA and find me a synagogue. Find me a church. I tried to buy some Christian like souvenirs for my family because they're still Christians. And I literally wandered around Bethlehem for almost 4 hours trying to find a Christian-owned store. Now, there's lots of places that will sell you a rosewood cross, but I wanted to support the Christian community in Bethlehem. And it was very difficult to find an actual Christian-owned store. So these are the kinds of things, you know, like, I see where you're coming from, but if we're going to talk about liberal democracy, we should also talk about the fact that in Israel, there is no death penalty for selling a house to an Arab. Like, you could sell a house right now in Jerusalem, in, let's say, the German quarter, right? They have all these different quarters. You could sell a house to an Arab right now. Your neighbors probably wouldn't be too happy with you, but at the end of the day, nothing else is going to happen to you. You could sell that house, and they could buy it and move in. And that's this whole idea that the JNF is saying, oh, well, no Arabs or no non-Jews can live there. Nobody lives in most of those places. It's national land. And to call them a terrorist organization for collecting money to plant trees just seems a little bit ridiculous.
Thank you, Rob. Well, Sean, I was going to say, Sean, you have the last kick at the cat, but I don't want to ascribe Eve as a cat. So you have the last question.
Okay. Yeah, my question is actually just, I don't know. I'm a dreamer. I like to think that maybe there could be a solution to the world's intractable problems. So I'm just curious, and I'll ask Brian first because it's your turn. But okay, well then I'm going to ask you. Okay.
I have a script, man. Stick to it.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Kind of nerve-wracking. Anyway, Eve, is there anything about the existence of, well, how shall I say this? I mean, what do you see actually as a potential solution to this ongoing issue? I know there's a number that have been put forth, and I don't expect you to come up with the answer to the world's problems, but I'm interested in hearing what you think Canada should be doing when it comes to interacting with Israel and other countries in the Middle East.
Yeah, I don't really take a position like what there's debates in the pro-Palestinian community about is it a two-state, is it one state, and those kinds of. I mostly stay out of that because I don't really see it's that much my role politically to engage with that. But I do agree. I do think that the second part, the latter part of what you were saying, is the important point: is what should Canada do? And at this point, we're mostly in a negative, right? Canada provides so many different forms of support to Palestinian dispossession that we just need to move towards stopping those forms of support, right? So the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement is more framed through like the positive, but of like actually getting towards like sanctions or stuff like that. But I think that the state is so complicit in so many ways. In that, if we ever came to the point where we were at with South Africa in 1986, where the Canadian government brought in formal sanctions, they were partial sanctions, and the extent to which Canada ever opposed apartheid in South Africa is a whole complicated story that's much mythologized today. But they did bring in formal sanctions that cut trade in half. We have, like I said, we have a trade agreement that accepts illegally occupied land. We have charities that are supporting this, directly subsidizing the Israeli military. This all needs to end, right? This needs to end. We shouldn't have. I would argue there shouldn't be any charity, any Canadian-based charity that's sending money to Israel, right? Or I mean, I think you probably get into some specifics around that, but essentially the big picture, like, yeah, there shouldn't be charities that are getting tax deductible status to send money to Britain. Why should there be to Israel? It's just as wealthy. And certainly there shouldn't be ones that are supporting racist institutions. Canada should stop, the Trudeau government is voting against, over and over again, all the UN resolutions upholding Palestinian rights. That's happening today at the UN. Our government, isolated with the US, Israel, and Micronesia and Palau, right? That's happening over and over again today, right now. Our Trudeau government, Canada is back, whatever Trudeau government, they're doing that right now at the UN. That should stop. Canada should support international law and vote and should support those resolutions. Yes, basically this is a question of power. The problem is the only way Palestinian dispossession has taken place and Zionism being successful is because of its support from initially, most importantly, British imperialism, but also today U.S. And countries like Canada. And Canada's been, never the lead player, but has been, third, fourth, right there in terms of its support for Israel. So if there's a chance at Palestinian liberation, if there's a chance at Palestinian, it comes through changing the way in which we here are helping put the boot on Palestinians' neck, right? That's what needs to change. That politically is what we need to concentrate on. And that's where there's a chance of a just resolution to the conflict. There's never going to be full justice, of course. Of course, the crimes that have been committed, and Palestinians are never going to get anything approaching full justice. But we can certainly lessen the amount that are killed going forward and move towards a situation where Palestinians have the capacities to define a bit of their future.
Thank you, Yves. Thank you, Tom. Well, now we move into interesting territory. We're going to throw the session open, and we'll invite questions from the audience. What I think will, I'm going to ask that people do ask questions rather than orations. I'm thinking sort of at 150 words, I'll cut you off. Undoubtedly it will be a spirited, I hope so, discussion. What I'd like people to do is come down to the mic. We'll let the questions come as they do, but if I get more than 3 in a row to one speaker, I'm going to jump a question to the other speaker to the head of the queue. All right? So I'm going to ask you to unfortunately queue here in the line to ask your questions. Thank you very much. And let's start. And your question, please say who your question is to. And if you want to identify yourself, please feel free to do so.
I'm Scott Fetty. Thanks for putting this on tonight. My question is for both speakers. What is each of your positions on UN Resolution 242 or the two-state solution? Thank you.
I mean, like I said, I don't, I kind of leave that up to Palestinians to come up with. Is it focus on a two-state or one state? What I can say from the standpoint of is Canada upholding UN opinion. I think that there's so many different ways in which Canada is undermining that, but I don't. I mean, I think that the whole question of is the solution two-state or one state? I'm of the opinion that probably you need to reduce tensions over time. There is going to need to be phases. I think that ultimately, long term, I think you want to reduce the power of state boundaries. Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
I think Ryan has.
Oh, sorry, Ryan.
242?
My apologies.
So I'm not a fan of the two-state delusion. I believe that 72% of the mandate that was actually initially promised according to international law, since we're talking about international law, 72% of that was already granted to the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. So technically there really is there are two states already. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that we need to make everybody move to one state or the other, but I think we've pretty much established that Palestinians don't want to live in a Jewish state, and Jews can't live in a Palestinian state. They just wouldn't be allowed. They've made that very clear. So that's my position on the two-state solution.
Succinct. Thank you.
Thanks. First of all, my question is to Yves solely. I can say with confidence that as a Christian Zionist, you don't have a clue what you're talking about. And if you ever taught history, God help us. But he said 150 words. That was about 15. Do not interrupt me.
Is this a question?
Do not interrupt me. Let me finish. Do not silence me. Do you understand? Thank you. 150 words. That was less than 150 words.
And just to be sporting and for a little bit of a laugh, let's not do ad hominems.
It's not ad hominems. He doesn't know what he's talking about. Well, I have two questions for Yves. Historically speaking, and any history student in this university or anyone else in the world would agree that Judea and Samaria are historic terms. They are not right-wing homonyms. Wikipedia will talk to you about Judea and Samaria. Any encyclopedia you look in will talk to you about Judea and Samaria. So in that context, I would like to tell this crowd, where are the historical borders of Judea and Samaria? And the second question, on Palestine. You do know that the term Palestine cannot even be pronounced in Arabic. It is Philistina from the Romans. Did you bring a map tonight with you, or do you have it in your book, to tell us where the historical boundaries of this so-called Palestine is? Where are the actual boundaries that exist prior to 1947?
Nice, straightforward, factual questions.
So the Philistina is with an F in Arabic. Okay. So it's not with a P.
You know it came from the Romans though, right?
Right.
Okay.
The British officials referred to it as Palestine? Of course they did. Right? But, I mean...
What about borders?
What's the borders of Palestine?
Yeah, where are they?
I think the borders of Palestine were British mandate, right?
Precisely though, where? Do you believe in from the river to the sea, from the Jordan to the sea, are that the borders of Palestine? Where are the borders?
Well,
Israel has borders. Where are the borders of
Okay,
Palestine?
you know,
I think I answered that, the British Mandate. Define it as the British Mandate, right? That's what historic Palestine is. And 22% is what Palestinians are still not even allowed. That's all what we're talking about, the two-state, all we're talking about is giving Palestinians a homeland on 22%. The other word, the concession of the two-state is 78% to Israel.
You do know that the map that Yasser Arafat had on his wall, I'll finish with this,
yeah.
was Palestine. The entire map on the wall behind Arafat's desk was all Palestine, from the river to the sea,
And-
all four corners.
And the map on the school in Toronto that 9 and 10-year-old kids were being shown as Israel had what? Was all of the territory, right? That's here in Canada today. That's on the side, let's not forget, that's on the side of the oppressor, right? The fact that there were people within the ANC that made anti-white comments in the 1980s, or that had maximalist rhetoric in their rising up against apartheid, is totally understandable, right? Yes, when you're under the boot of a colonial occupier, you tend to, be angry. Understandable.
I do apologize. I should have made more clear the questioning process. Not only are we confined to 150 words and a question, I will allow one follow-up that should be a clarification germane on the matter of the original question. Okay, and I've done enough Oxford debating in my time to rule people out of orders. So this is a passionate subject, and rightly so. But we really, the conversation will just collapse if we don't observe these rules. Sir.
Thanks for having us. As a follow-up, I just want to speak about a historical thing to Mr. Ryan. The first who lived in Jerusalem was the Yebusiyin from Canaan, and it was the name of the city Ur as-Salam. It's the city of peace, which was stolen to Urushalim later. This is as a historical follow-up. And regarding about how genocide, your definition to genocide, what has done the gangs, Argon, Stern, Haganah, when they did genocides in...
Is there a question?
Yeah, according to your definition to genocide, these Argon, Haganah, Stern, didn't they commit genocides against Palestinian people? And speaking about who wants the solution, when Mr. Rabin wanted a solution of two states, he was assassinated by Israeli people. And there is a historical, his name is Shlomo Sand.
I got one question already with the Stern Gang and the Irgun terrorists. I don't know if that question is much fun, but is that your question?
Well, according to his definition,
right.
They displaced people, they killed people from Deir Yassin, from a lot of cities in Palestine.
Yeah.
They were trained in British camps.
That's okay. So the question is...
Yeah, did they commit genocide or not?
Okay.
That's the first question.
Right.
And you said I have the right to follow up, right? And he said these people that we should be against, these people that they don't allow women to drive. I want to tell him, these, which means some Arabic Sunni countries, their biggest coalition for now for Israel, and they're making coalition to strike against Iran and Hezbollah, and they're the closest ally to Israel right now. Thank you.
Okay, I didn't get the question.
So I'm just asking him, I'm just telling him that the country that he said we should stand against, that they stand against the driving women to drive,
right.
It's now the biggest coalition for Israel, and they're making an ally for Sunni and Israel countries to strike against Iran and Hezbollah.
Oh, okay. Right.
Yeah, those famous Zionists, the Saudi Arabians. Give me a break. All right, so first things first, I'm going to tell him something really simple. Like, he basically just said what I said. I was very clear about what a genocide is and what a genocide is not. Did your people have a massive depopulation or not? Right? Because everybody in this room thinks that genocide is the massive depopulation of a people, which never happened to people in Palestine.
Really?
Good luck with that. What is the total population now versus the population in 1947? That's a fact. You can argue whatever you want, you can have your own opinions, but facts matter.
You don't even know your facts.
450,000 in 1947 and over 6 million now. That's not a genocide. Give your head a shake.
Oh, really?
You know, clearly one we're going to agree to disagree on. Now,
Hello, my name is Janan. I was born in Palestine, grew up in Palestine, went to school in Palestine. So I just wanted to thank you, first of all, for raising concerns in terms of illegal settlements, the siege on Gaza, all of that stuff. It's very, very tough, points to bring up. For Ryan, as to, well, my question is, I'm just really curious to know how else can we support illegal settlements, checkpoints. I went to school, I would have checkpoints stopping me. Do I, as a student in 3rd grade, 2nd grade, do I need a checkpoint to get me off the bus, to check my bag? Is that humane? I don't think so, but.
Is there a question?
Sorry, it's quite, yeah, there was, I already
are the
asked it.
security measures justified?
Yeah, how do you justify the support?
Very easily, very easily. It was a 17-year-old that stabbed my best friend, well, not my best friend, but a very close friend of mine in the back, while he was grocery shopping.
People here in Calgary.
Yeah, but did they yell Allah Akbar and tell him they thought they were Yehudis? I mean, let's be intelligent here. Stabbed him in the back. Why do you think it was? It was an Arab person.
Excuse me. Really, honestly.
If we're going to talk, okay, second off, let's talk about, this is important. You guys want to talk about illegal settlements.
Can we avoid anecdote?
What law, I'm curious, what law, can you tell me that? Because so far I was going to ask Yves that. What law specifically says that the settlements are illegal? Go ahead and tell me. She's asking me a question, I'm asking her a question. If you're going to tell me that the settlements are illegal, then tell me how they're illegal. I'd like to know what law it is that makes these settlements illegal.
When you come in, sorry, can I follow up for that?
Yeah, you can have a follow-up, but not before I say, gentlemen, I would appreciate it if you did not incite the mob to riot. Okay? By asking open-ended questions, please. Please, ma'am.
Okay, I'm going to say something very simple. I think
I just answered the question. I answered your question.
Yeah.
Let her finish.
When you come in, demolish homes, and this has happened to family members of mine. You demolish homes, you are cutting farmland in half. You are separating families. I don't know what part of that itself. We don't even need to talk about
International law. No, you brought up international law. I would like to know what international law makes the settlements illegal.
Sir, I'm a 19-year-old who doesn't know every single law.
Clearly.
I'm just telling you this. But I have lived this personally, and I don't think you can speak to half of that. Respectfully. But what I will get at is when you come in and demolish, I don't care who the land is for, what religion it belongs to, who the people were there, who was there first, or who needs to be there last. When we talk about human rights, I want to know, how does Canada, how is it justifiable to support the inhumane acts, bombing, settlements, checkpoints at schools, children being in prison? My own uncle was in prison, so I just want to know that. That's the only question.
We got the question. Again, I appreciate the importance of expressing passions that are deeply felt. It's sometimes irresistible to look someone one doesn't agree with in the eye and let them have it. But really, this can't be a forum for that. What we need to do is try to at least embarrass our opponent with reason. Okay? So, Eve, do you want to try to answer this question? About when, or sorry, Ryan.
The Canadian government.
It was, the question was, I'm sorry, my mistake.
Actually.
It was,
So
it was
we can let you
Right,
pontificate if you
yeah.
like, but.
Well, Ryan, do you understand the question?
Absolutely.
All right, go ahead.
It's really simple. If you can't tell me how it's international law is telling us that they're illegal settlements, then you shouldn't be calling them illegal settlements.
Okay.
The Canadian government considers them illegal.
What law? Tell me what law. What law? Do you have a
The
book?
4th Geneva Convention, the Canadian government's legal opinion is they're illegal settlements. Come off of it. I mean, the whole world considers them illegal settlements.
Except that a noted international law expert, Eugene Kontorovich, actually
top
debunked
Israeli
that.
government officials, come on, the International Court of Justice in 2004, in their court ruling around the wall, illegal settlement, come on, like it's a joke.
Gentlemen, imagine circumstances where you could talk either your opponent into agreeing with your position. We're really going to just deal with the audience questions at this point.
I think it's a
Sir.
good idea.
Hi, my question is for Ryan, and what I'll say is I have troubles with your definition of what you call indigenous peoples. By your definition, I'd have to argue that Confederates in America could be an indigenous person. In 1943, President Roosevelt declared that America, and this would be after hundreds of years of settlement there, declared that America was essentially white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, and that everybody else was just living there. So by your definition, if you're saying Métis is a indigenous person, I say that Americans have a right to declare themselves white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. To call themselves indigenous by your same definition,
And
I don't know how you differ that.
I think he wants me to explain.
Well, my question would be, so question one, to maybe differentiate how that's indigenous. And my second question would be, in addition to this, I would say that Scottish, British, German, all sorts of European nationalist movements would have the same right as Israelis to declare themselves to be indigenous peoples. In the late 1990s, Canada put sanctions on Austria because the Freedom Party of George Hayter was in power there. So does Canada then, if it has an obligation to support indigenous peoples, does it have an obligation to support white nationalist movements across Europe when the European Union is putting sanctions on them?
Okay, so what's indigeneity?
Okay, so first off, no, Confederates are not indigenous. You answered your own question when you said that they said they're white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Where do any of those things come from? They don't come from the United States. What language do Americans speak? They speak English. They speak a language that came from somewhere else. They worship the Creator in a manner that came from somewhere else. They are not indigenous. So hopefully that answers both of your
Do
questions.
you consider Mexicans indigenous to Mexico?
Mexicans, as in like just the average everyday Mexican, or Mexicans that actually are indigenous people?
The majority of Mexicans today,
Okay,
do
so
you consider them indigenous to Mexico?
you do understand that there are indigenous peoples in Mexico, right? You understand
Well,
that
you
there
do
are actual
understand that
indigenous
Spanish, a language from Spain, from Europe,
that
is the
came from
official
somewhere
language,
else, and their
is the
religion came
official
from somewhere
language
else.
of Mexico.
Can Ryan answer the question, please?
I don't understand why you can't seem to understand what I've just told you. That if everything that about you comes from somewhere else, and you did not have a cultural coalescence on the land that you're claiming is your ancestral land, you're not indigenous. It's very clear. So this whole idea about, because I'm talking about nationalism, like, what was that? No, sorry. What did you say?
Yeah, oh, well, that was so off limits. Thank you very much. We've had three
But
questions.
you still haven't answered about both the European Union and
You know what?
white nationalism
he-
there.
answered them pretty clearly.
Yeah, he spoke to your question at least. We've had three in a row for Ryan now, and by my own rules, I think someone needs to give Eve a hard time. Is there anyone who'd like to do that?
David?
Yes.
Can I ask one question, please?
Well, of course.
On the onset, you said that this is a respectful conversation and we're to respect people's opinions and the questions and stuff.
Yes.
Brian, can you do the same for people who are asking you questions when you're answering them and not go next?
And
I'll do what I
to
can.
whom were you going to ask your question? You're going to go to Ryan, aren't you?
I'm
Is there?
going to ask a question of both the contestants.
Perfect. I like contestant. Go ahead, please.
I'm a retired English teacher, and I taught dialogically, so I listened to a lot of opinions that were kind of half-assed. But I knew that if you gave people time enough to listen and talk, I believed that they would come to something resembling truth and justice. There was one rule in my class, however. You did not call people stupid. You did not claim that if someone disagreed with you, they were missing something or they hadn't understood it. I have a question about indigeneity. I'm a farm girl from Saskatchewan, third generation. I culturally coalesced there. I've culturally coalesced in Canada. And I've been fighting for the last 10 years against pipelines because I do believe in climate change. And I love this land with every fiber of my being. What are we doing here, making some academic, mansplaining definition of indigeneity work for one small group of people back to the beginning of time? What are we talking about? Because to me, it sounds like patent nonsense, and I'd like to ask Eve to respond to that first, if you will.
Well, I completely concur. I mean, the idea is that Romans expelled in 13, 14 centuries later, like people who were in Russia are all rooted, like, I mean, I can't believe that argument was even made.
Well, it was tonight.
So you don't support the rights of Indigenous peoples?
I'm going to have to ask you to respond to the question then.
Oh, it's a pretty easy one, actually. So, you're not Indigenous. It's that simple. You're from Saskatchewan. You're white. I don't know what part of Europe you're from, and I'm not ascribing a value to that either. You have just as many rights in Canada as anybody else, but you're not Indigenous. Your cultural coalescence, what religion are you? How do you follow the Creator? What language do you speak at home?
Originally, it was Sons of Odin.
Oh my goodness. All right. Yeah. So
Now,
I'm
this
going to
is
do my
fine.
best to do what that lady said, and that's just to, I'll just be nice.
Very good. Victoria.
I've got two separate questions, one for Ives and one for Ryan. Is that all right?
Absolutely.
Okay, I'll start with Ryan. Francis Widdowson mentioned something to this effect earlier, that the traditional homeland of the Jews, as you put it, has, or rather that the idea of a homeland can be contested. And I think that the case of Palestine is an excellent example of it. You mentioned that the indigenous peoples are a coalition of a people. We're not the Palestinians who resided in Israeli territories coalesced as a people, in which case we have a crisis in which two people strongly identify with the exact same homeland. My question is, first, do you agree with that statement? And second, how do you think we can reconcile this dilemma if you do?
So that's a really good question. And that's actually one of the reasons I started getting involved in this. So first off, the Arabs that live there now didn't actually have a cultural coalescence. So it's important to understand what a cultural coalescence is. So if you have a cultural coalescence, that means that you actually have a method of worshiping the Creator that started where you are, right? You developed that method of worshiping the Creator. You would have a language that you developed. It's your language. Now, we can sit here and we can talk about indigeneity all we want. I have no problem talking about indigenous status. The truth of the matter is that the Arabs are Arabs. Now, were they Arabized? Are they people that carry blood from a different people? Absolutely. I believe Eve actually said it when he said, he basically said they're mixed race. He quoted somebody from the people that he's quoting about international law, stating that these people were of a mixed race, and that the majority were there for less than 40 years at that point, right? So if we're gonna hold people to standards of what they say, absolutely. That's exactly what you said. I wrote it down.
Gentlemen, please.
Now, if we're going to talk about indigenous status and the cultural coalescence and the creation of a people, you have to understand what that actually means.
All right, if you guys are going to pass notes in class, that's going to be a
I'm not going to check yes or no.
You now have the opportunity to respond to Victoria's interesting question.
I also have a separate question for you.
Oh, I'm sorry, Victoria, I thought you were throwing it up for the world. But
Well,
no,
I can read one. I can read what the British government, like when I get into this, British government 1920. Let me reread it. Saying there's 700,000 people in Palestine. Quote: 4/5 of the whole population are Muslims. A small proportion of these are Bedouin Arabs. The remainder, although they speak Arabic and are termed Arabs, are largely of mixed race. Some 77,000 of the population are Christian, a large majority belonging to the Orthodox Church and speaking Arabic. The minority are members of the Latin or of the Unite Greek Catholic Church, or a small number are Protestants. The Jewish element of the population numbers 76,000. Almost all have entered Palestine during the last 40 years. Prior to 1850, there were in the country only a handful of Jews.
British anthropology for you. Excellent. Victoria, your second question.
Yes, now part of my question springs from my ignorance, so you might have already kind of answered it. A lot of your contention with Canadian support of Israel is based on what I would consider rather extreme groups. And I was wondering, not looking at a percentage of how many groups you would consider to have extreme militant views versus the ones that don't, but do you see a solution or some support that we could give that doesn't encourage some of the militancy people have complained about? And you mentioned the two-state solution, which might be the answer to the question. Could you elaborate, if it is, on what that would entail?
Well, yeah, when we sell weapons to the Israeli Defense Force, we're supporting an extreme group. We're supporting a group that's killed 200 recently in Gaza, peaceful demonstrators that killed 2,200 in 2014, that killed 1,400 in 2008, 2009. That's an extreme group. Yeah. So, I mean, I don't know what when you're trying to tease out the question of extreme groups, are you meaning when I talk about the Jewish National Fund being extreme group, or are you talking about, like, if you take a spectrum of the charities in this country that are allowed to operate, there are a whole bunch that support the Israeli military. There are a whole bunch that support settlements in the West Bank, illegal settlements in the West Bank. There's a whole bunch, but it's one, at least in the JNF, an important one, that supports an explicitly racist organization. If you go further and you look at, so now the solution is that this is a power question, right? The Palestinians are the weaker party, and they've always been the weaker party. And you can't, if you want to have justice, you have to stop supporting the powerful that's oppressing the weaker. That's how you bring about justice. And that's what we need to do. Not people who are sitting in Calgary, we need to stop the ways in which public and private institutions in this country are supporting the oppressor. That's how we're going to do our best to enable the weaker party to assert itself and to get some degree of justice.
Thanks, Eve. I'm going to move
Thank you.
thank you, Victoria. That's great. Sir.
Hi, I have a question for both gentlemen because there's something I'm confused about. I heard tonight that Arabs can buy land in Israel, but I also keep hearing about home demolitions. And recently I heard about a home demolition where they said that the home was demolished because the owner couldn't get a permit and built it without a permit. So, like, is there some kind of a catch-22 going on there, or is there just a bigger contradiction?
Well, the Jewish National Fund, you can go on the Jewish National Fund of Canada's Twitter, and they say they hold the land on behalf of Jewry around the world. That's their Twitter tag, right? It's an exclusivist Twitter tag, and it's not hidden, right? So the JNF, they control 13% of the land. The Israel Land Authority, I think it's about 93% of it. We're not talking about West Bank here. I'm not talking about the illegally occupied West Bank. I'm talking about in so-called Israel proper. And there's the Palestinians that did not get driven out in 47, 48. They've not been allowed, their communities have not been allowed to expand, so they are just on the land that they have, while conversely, of course, Jewish communities have expanded in their newer ones. So essentially Israel, in a whole series of kind of complicated different ways, makes it quasi-impossible to legally expand Arab communities within Israel proper, and we support that, and that's, I don't know how you can argue, from a liberal democracy standpoint, how you could argue in favor of that.
Right.
Just so you know, there's a place called Abu Ghosh. It's a village just outside of Jerusalem. It's actually famous for having the best hummus in Israel. Arab village. It's grown something like 37% in the last 10 years. So I don't know where he's getting his facts from. Like if you want to go and Google things, it's very easy, but unfortunately there's a lot of misleading stuff out there. Now, he just said 13% of the land is owned by the JNF, 13% of the land. So what this charity does is it buys land and then it collects money and it plants trees and it does all kinds of terrorist things like that. Now, the unfortunate thing is that we're even having this discussion because quite frankly, it's kind of offensive. These people are allowed to have their own land. Jews are allowed to have an ancestral homeland. The whole idea of the Balfour Declaration, of the San Remo Accords, the League of Nations mandate, they all said the same thing. The Jews come from a specific place called Israel, and that's their ancestral homeland. So, and I apologize for getting off topic on your question, but I mean, about the demolitions. I don't agree with them. I'll tell you right now. There's Jewish houses that get demolished all the time because they don't have the proper permits. There's Arab houses that get demolished all the time because they don't have the proper permits.
Give us one example.
What's that?
Is there someone here that can back that statement?
You know, I think we'll have to.
One example, what house? Is there any house, a Jewish house?
They demolished.
I appreciate the interest in the depth of the question, but I think we'll have to take the speaker's claims as spoken and do the evidentiary bit in a more suitable form. I apologize that is the way it is, but I think that's how we have to roll. We have time for 2 more questions. Well, if you're really brisk and these guys are...
My own question is about creative thinking, and this is a great forum on critical thinking. So thank everybody. I've learned a lot from Ryan and from Eve, of course. And but my question for creative thinking and indeed for dialogue, and if you, the 2 books that are on the table there, William Isaacs and David Bohm, have developed the concept of dialogue. So we have twice weekly dialogues in Calgary, and everybody's invited. But my background is, I was 19 years old at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, October 1962. A lot of people did not think they would live to see Christmas. It's over. So I'm concerned about human extinction. And my question for you is, and you don't have to answer, it's not sort of like you have to answer on the spot right now, no. Think about it if you have an idea that's, for example, Ryan, you and I had a great coffee and conversation. There's one answer to the question. What are creative ideas for moving away from this us versus them way of thinking towards a healthy global community in which we think of each other as family? I am concerned about your well-being. I want to know what you have to say and what you have to think. What are creative, specific ideas for how we can move in that direction? If you have something now, that's great, but if not, please come to our dialogues and offer the... So it's a question for both of you. Yeah, and for all of you as well.
Thank you very much for that question. Gentlemen, do you want to make a quick response? It demands a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is done not just intellectually, but by action. I think by people standing up and going against the dominant ethos in our political culture of supporting Palestinian dispossession, by taking the time to go on a picket line, maybe hand out a leaflet about some element of Palestine, how Palestinians are being dispossessed, about people having real internationalism, to take on issues that are going to get you in trouble, like Palestine Solidarity tends to do, where you get attacked. As I understand it, the University of Calgary, the Palestine Solidarity group got viciously attacked, and it's largely dormant or disappeared. The way you build a real sense of internationalism and a sense of, I've never been to Palestine. I don't have, I now have a few friends of Palestinian descent, but I'm doing this because I believe this is what's right. And how you build that is by doing it, right? By not being scared, not by saying, yes, our media tells us that anybody who stands up for Palestinians is an anti-Semite. I'm going to run away from that. Our media tells us that that Israel is the democracy and we should be supporting the democracy. No, you look at an issue, you see that one side there's an injustice going on, and you act to overcome that. So I don't think it's as much an intellectual exercise of like we need to have this sort of dialogue to show our humaneness with the other person. It's by our actions. But if people in this room have 2 hours a week that they can spend to lessen Canada's contribution to an injustice taking place in Palestine and or many other parts of the world, and I've engaged in many different other international causes. That's how you really build a sense of internationalism, and not just because that person is sitting next to me am I going to be compassionate towards them, but because it's the right thing to do. We should all believe in a collective humanity, and now even more than ever with the question of climate change, I think we have to believe in a collective humanity. We have to build real internationalism. These nationalisms, these forms of oppressions are blocking us from building real internationalism.
Very good. Thank you. Ryan?
I'll be quick.
Yep.
I'll be quick. So, I grew up in a place that has no running water. Most of the houses on Paddle Prairie Métis settlement don't have running water. So think about that for a second. So I'm a little less concerned about globalism than I am about my own people. I'm a little irritated that we just sent $60 million to the Palestinian Authority, and meanwhile we have reserves with no drinking water. So I'm not a globalist, I am a tribalist. I do believe that we should be looking after ourselves, and then we can start trying to solve other people's problems. But when I started talking about Israel, I started talking about Israel because I firmly believe that as an Indigenous person, I should be standing up and speaking out when I see Indigenous people being smeared. It's that simple. Now, do I think that means that we should all be fighting? No. I don't. It would be really cool if we could just all get along, but we all know how likely that is to happen. So, dialogue and discourse, I firmly believe in it, but I don't necessarily think that everything's going to change in the next few days.
Very good. Thank you. Ma'am?
Thank you. I want to thank both speakers, Ryan and Eve. Ryan, it's interesting what you said at the very end. You said, do I agree that Canada should send $60,000 to Palestinians? $60 million to Palestinians when in First Nation territories there's no running water. So the question is Canada's support for Israel justifiable? Do you still think it's justifiable?
I don't believe in monetary support, and I've been very clear about that. I don't think that we should be having they call it tied aid, where we say, okay, we're going to give Israel this much money, but then they have to spend it on whatever. Usually with America and Canada, it's weapons. I don't agree with that. I don't think we should be sending money at all.
We agree that they shouldn't be sending money, because just a while ago you were justifying that they should be sending money.
I think we should be.
You were justifying that what Canada does is they support Israel in building their territory on their native land. Am I wrong in my understanding?
I think you're misunderstanding me. I didn't say monetarily supporting. I do believe that we have a moral and ethical
That would be nice,
if
if it was moral and ethical, if I am to agree with you. The point I have is, or the problem I have with your claims, as David called them, they are claims. When I hear Yves talk, he talks from facts, international law, dates, quote. Your claims seems to be coming from your pain and suffering as a First Nation person, and it's justifiable because what happened to First Nation people on this land is unacceptable.
Could we have a question rather than analysis?
Yes,
I think?
yes. So my question to you is, do you feel that your support for what you feel is the original or the indigenous people of a land comes from your suffering, instead of looking at the fact that the land of Palestine, actually belonged to the Canaanites before it belongs to the Jews?
Okay, so do you want me to answer your question? Because I absolutely...
Yes, please.
So, my support for Israel is moral, ethical, and rational. It's based completely on a factual analysis of the situation.
Which is?
Which is that the Jews are the indigenous people of the area.
The Kenyans are the indigenous people of the area.
Do you know any Canaanites? Or Canaanites?
Do you know any Jews that lived at that time that actually there?
I know some Jewish people that have actually lived there for over 20 generations.
And what do they feel about? That's wonderful. In Palestine, before the Zionist movement, Christians, Palestinians, and Jews lived in Palestine.
You know that the Arabs got there in the 7th century, right?
Regardless, they lived in harmony before the political movement of the Zionism movement came.
We're now into bickering about an irresolvable question.
I think
We're
my point.
disagreeing on the terms.
I think my point was that. Thank
You did. Thank you.
According to the Old Testament, the Canaan were living...
Oh, good heavens. Please. We're almost out of here. Thank you. We can have these arguments in the streets later. Thank you. Again, I appreciate how important these questions are to people and how invested we are in them. But again, this forum has limitations.
Is on that topic. Where was the Garden of Eden?
I have no idea. I'm not a Christian.
No.
I have no idea what the Garden of Eden is.
It's nothing to do with Christianity.
Okay, so the question was, where's the Garden of Eden? I can't believe you blew your chance at the mic on that question.
Well, it's not my only question.
I knew that. All right. What is your real question then?
My real question is, we've talked all day using the words Canada support, Israel justifiable. We've used those words in the context of jumping time frames. We're half a sentence would be Canada in 1940 and the other half would be Canada in 1980, another jumping, and it's just confusing. But at present time, what do you think the popular support is for the government policy, for the Zionist policy, for these various groups? Because my feeling is that when you travel and you speak to people on the ground, you find out that all these official representatives that are being discussed here uniquely don't represent the people that they're pretending or supposed to represent. And what do you know about actual figures of what representative of the population the Zionists are and such?
I'm pretty sure Yves is going to agree with me. It all depends on the poll. It literally depends on the poll and the polling body. Because I've seen polls that came from CJPME, and they say that categorically people support the Palestinians. And I've seen polls that came from Ipsos Reid that say everybody supports the Israelis. But my personal opinion is that you can tell by the crowd. There's going to be, look, it's 80-20-20, 80% of the, or 80-10-10. 80% of the people don't give a shit. 10% are really strongly pro-Israeli and 10% are really strong pro-Palestinian.
Don't giving this shit is an
They don't
important
care. It
group.
doesn't affect them.
It does affect them.
They don't think
Well,
so.
gentlemen, now we've got the question on the table. I think Yves ought to get a kick out of it.
Yeah, I mean, Ryan just alluded to a poll that was the first really serious poll to look at. It was sponsored by Independent Jewish Voices, Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East, and a few prominent journalists, and prominent left-wing journalists, I should say. And I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, of course, but it showed that there was a whole lot of sympathy to the idea of Canada bringing in sanctions against Israel. And it did so, of course, it asked the question with the backgrounder that Canada has sanctions against, I think it's 19 different countries, right? So this whole idea that sanctions is some sort of like, we'd be singling Israel out and all that kind of rhetoric. Actually we actually have sanctions. There's lots of countries, and so it showed a lot of support for the basic premise of the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, and it showed that there's growing negative opinion towards Israel in Canada, and obviously that skews as you know the people who identified as being NDP members were much more critical of Israel than Conservative Party members, and people can check out the poll. I do kind of agree with Ryan in the sense that most of the population, of course, doesn't know very much about the issue, is not particularly invested in the issue, doesn't, you could argue, doesn't care, if you like. And that's part of why I try to orient my look at this issue from a Canadian angle, not that it's just some abstract thing, but that we're contributing, we're involved, you can't just remove yourself. I also do want to mention, on the stuff about polls, the Canadian Jewish Congress polls going back into the mid-2000s show very clearly that the more people know about the issue, the more sympathetic they are to Palestinians, right? That's you can find those polls online, done by Canadian Jewish Congress in the mid-2000s. So I think that, to me, that's heartening from a standpoint of being engaged in Palestine solidarity. We need to keep working at it, and it's been successful in building sympathy for the Palestinian cause, but we need to keep working at it, and it's about bypassing the dominant media, by bypassing sort of the dominant, and through activist means, which is how most real transformation takes place.
I'm sorry, we're going to have to leave it there. We've run over time. Yeah, I'd corner him later. I am sorry, but we are over time. I would like to thank everyone for participating, and I'm sorry to have been such a pain, but I do appreciate you coming.